The summer sun was beating down on London's busy streets as Jake Henderson, a 23-year-old American tourist, sat with his three college friends at a small cafe near Buckingham Palace. It was their third day in London, and boredom had started to creep in after visiting the usual tourist spots. Jake scrolled through his phone, his half-eaten breakfast getting cold on the plate in front of him. His friend Mike suddenly nudged him, showing a viral video of tourists trying to make the royal guards laugh or break their famous straight-face stance. "Dude, these videos are getting millions of views," Mike said, adjusting his baseball cap. "We should do something like this. Think about it. We could go viral." Sarah, the most sensible one in their group, shook her head. "Guys, those guards are actual soldiers. We shouldn't mess with them." But Tom, their fourth friend, was already excited about the idea. He picked up an egg from his plate, examining it with a mischievous grin. "Hey, this egg's gone bad. Smells horrible." He pushed it towards Jake. "I dare you to use this." Jake, known for never backing down from a dare since his freshman year, felt his pride kick in. Back home in Ohio, he was famous for his pranks on social media, with over 50,000 followers who loved his crazy stunts. This could be his biggest hit yet. "How much?" Jake asked, raising an eyebrow. $200 if you do it," Tom replied, pulling out his wallet. "Each of us will put in 50. Sarah tried one more time to be the voice of reason. "This is stupid. We could get in serious trouble. These aren't mall security guards, they're trained military personnel." But Jake wasn't listening. His mind was already racing with possibilities. He imagined the video going viral, his follower count exploding, and maybe even getting interviewed by those big YouTube channels. The fame and attention seemed worth any risk. Mike carefully wrapped the rotten egg in a napkin and slipped it into Jake's jacket pocket. "Just make sure you get away fast after throwing it," he advised, already setting up his phone to record. The group paid their bill and walked towards Buckingham Palace. The morning crowd was starting to build up, with tourists from all over the world gathering to watch the famous changing of the guard ceremony. Jake felt his heart beating faster as they got closer. They positioned themselves near the guard post, blending in with other tourists taking photos. The royal guard stood perfectly still, wearing the famous red uniform and tall bearskin hat. His polished boots gleamed in the sunlight, and his rifle rested perfectly against his shoulder. Jake's palms were sweating as he felt the egg in his pocket. A small voice in his head, sounding surprisingly like Sarah's, warned him this was a terrible idea. But then he thought about the video, the views, the followers, and the stupid pride that wouldn't let him back down from a dare. Tom whispered from behind, "Come on, man, do it now while there aren't many people watching." Sarah had walked away, wanting nothing to do with their plan. She stood at a distance, pretending not to know them. Jake took a deep breath. His hand trembled slightly as he reached into his pocket. The rotten egg felt warm and slightly sticky. It had definitely gone bad in the morning heat. The smell made him wrinkle his nose in disgust. Mike had his phone ready, recording everything. Tom stood nearby, trying to act casual while keeping an eye out for any police officers. But they couldn't notice the CCTV cameras positioned discreetly around the area, or the plainclothes officers mixed in with the tourist crowd. Jake stepped closer to the guard, pretending to pose for a photo. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. The guard remained motionless, staring straight ahead, unaware of what was about to happen. "This is going to be epic," Jake thought to himself, gripping the egg tighter. He looked back at his friends one last time, saw their encouraging nods, and made his decision. In just a few seconds, he would do something that would change the course of his entire vacation, and possibly his life. What Jake didn't know was that his next action would lead to consequences far beyond a viral video or a couple $100s. As he prepared to throw the egg, he was completely unaware that in less than 15 minutes, he would find himself in handcuffs, facing charges that would make him regret ever accepting this foolish dare. Time seemed to slow down as Jake pulled the rotten egg from his pocket. Around him, tourists were taking photos, children were pointing at the guard's tall bearskin hat, and everything appeared normal on this sunny London morning. With his heart racing, Jake took 3 steps forward. The guard remained perfectly still, his eyes focused straight ahead. Jake's fingers tightened around the egg, and without giving himself time to reconsider, he threw it. The rotten egg sailed through the air in a perfect arc. "Splat!" The egg hit the guard's bright red uniform right in the chest, exploding into a disgusting yellow mess. The putrid smell immediately filled the air, making nearby tourists gasp and cover their noses. Some people screamed in shock, while others quickly backed away from the scene. The guard didn't move a muscle. His face remained expressionless, though a drop of rotten egg yolk slowly dripped down his pristine uniform. This only made Jake laugh harder, feeling a rush of excitement from his successful prank. Did you get that? Jake turned to Mike, who was still recording everything on his phone. This is going to break the internet. Tom was already laughing hysterically, bent over and clutching his stomach. I can't believe you actually did it. This is insane. Tourists around them had very different reactions. An elderly British woman shook her head in disgust, muttering "disgraceful" under her breath. A father quickly led his children away from the scene, giving Jake a look of pure disapproval. Some Asian tourists were recording the incident on their phones, while others looked shocked and embarrassed. Quick, upload it before anything happens, Jake said to Mike, still riding high on adrenaline. He posed next to the egg-splattered guard for a quick selfie, completely oblivious to the serious situation he had just created. Sarah, who had been watching from a distance, finally stormed over. "Are you guys completely stupid?" she hissed. "We need to get out of here right now." But Jake was too busy planning his social media caption. "Should I go with egging on the Royal Guard or sunny side up at Buckingham Palace?" he asked, completely missing the growing tension in the air. What Jake and his friends failed to notice was the subtle movement around them, a middle-aged man in a tourist t-shirt speaking quietly into his sleeve. A woman with a camera who had suddenly stopped taking photos and was talking into a small radio. Two men in jogging outfits who had stopped their morning run and were now walking purposefully toward their group. The guard remained motionless, but his eyes had noted every detail of the incident. His years of training helped him maintain his composure, even as the rotten egg dripped down his uniform. The smell was horrible, but he stood firm, knowing that the situation was already being handled by the proper authorities. Jake was still laughing and checking his phone, expecting to see the video already gaining views. "Hey, maybe we should try another one," he suggested, drunk on his own foolishness. "I think Tom still has another egg." "Me tiro politean polici. Stay where you are." The command came from behind Jake, sharp and authoritative. The plainclothes officers who had been disguised as tourists suddenly converged on the group. The joggers, the woman with the camera, and the man in the tourist t-shirt, all of them were police officers. The color drained from Jake's face as he felt a firm hand on his shoulder. Mike dropped his phone in shock, and Tom stopped laughing immediately. Sarah just stood there, shaking her head with a mixture of anger and disappointment. "Sir, you're under arrest for assault on a member of the Queen's Guard and disorderly conduct," said one of the officers, his tourist disguise now seeming obvious as he pulled out his badge. Tourists who had been disgusted by Jake's prank were now filming his arrest, their phones capturing every moment of his humiliation. The tables had turned. Instead of becoming famous for his prank video, he was about to become infamous for his arrest. As the reality of the situation began to sink in, Jake realized that his simple dare had just become a serious legal matter. The thrill of his momentary fame was quickly replaced by the cold feeling of handcuffs being placed around his wrists. The guard continued to stand at his post, as still as a statue, while Jake's world crumbled around him. In just a few minutes, his dream of viral fame had turned into a nightmare that would follow him long after his London vacation was over. The crowd of tourists had grown larger now, but they weren't taking pictures of the Royal Guard anymore. All phones were pointed at Jake as the police officers led him away from Buckingham Palace. His face burned with shame as he heard the whispers and saw the disapproving looks from everyone around him. "Please, this was just a joke," Jake tried to explain, his voice shaking. "I didn't mean any harm. It was just for social media." The lead officer, who had introduced himself as Inspector Wilson, wasn't impressed. "Assaulting a member of the Queen's Guard isn't a joke, young man. This is a serious offense." Mike, Tom, and Sarah stood frozen, watching their friend being detained. Mike was still holding his phone, but it had been seized by another officer who was now reviewing the video evidence. Tom's face had gone pale, the reality of their prank finally hitting him. "You three will need to come with us as well," another officer informed Jake's friends. "We'll need your statements about this incident." Sarah stepped forward, her voice trembling with anger. "I told them not to do it. I tried to stop them, but they wouldn't listen." Inside the police van, Jake sat in silence, the handcuffs cold against his wrists. Through the window, he could see a fresh guard marching out to replace the one he had hit with the egg. The changing ceremony was performed with dignity, despite the stain on the previous guard's uniform. At the police station, Jake was led to a small, bright room with a metal table and 3 chairs. The reality of his situation began to sink in as Inspector Wilson sat across from him, placing a folder on the table. "Mr. Henderson," the inspector began, opening the folder, "do you understand the seriousness of what you've done today?" Jake nodded weakly, his earlier confidence completely gone. His phone had been confiscated, and he couldn't even call his parents back in Ohio to tell them what had happened. "The Royal Guards are not street performers or tourist attractions," Inspector Wilson continued. "They are active duty soldiers who protect the royal family and perform ceremonial duties. What you did today was not just disrespectful, it was criminal." In another room, Mike and Tom were giving their statements. Both were trying to distance themselves from the incident, but their video evidence proved their involvement in planning the prank. "We just thought it would be funny," Mike explained nervously to the officer interviewing him. "We didn't think it would be such a big deal." The officer looked at him sternly. "Everything that happens around Buckingham Palace is a big deal. There are hundreds of CCTV cameras and undercover officers in the area at all times. Did none of you consider the consequences?" Meanwhile, Sarah was giving her own statement, her voice full of frustration. "I kept telling them it was a stupid idea. The guards are soldiers, not toys for tourist entertainment. But they were so focused on getting views and likes." Back in the interview room, Jake learned that his passport would be temporarily confiscated. He would need to appear in court before being allowed to leave the country. The fine could be substantial, and the incident would become part of his permanent record. "Your actions today could have serious implications for your future," Inspector Wilson explained. "This will show up on background checks. It could affect your ability to travel internationally. Was a social media video worth all that?" Jake stared at his hands, now free from the handcuffs but still shaking. The excitement of the morning felt like a distant dream now. His grand plan for viral fame had backfired spectacularly. Outside the police station, news of the incident was already spreading. Local news reporters had gathered, hoping to get a statement. Tourists who had filmed the incident were uploading their videos, but not the kind of viral content Jake had hoped for. Instead of being famous for his prank, he was becoming infamous for his arrest. The day was only half over, but Jake's life had already changed dramatically. As he sat in the police station, waiting to hear about his court date, he couldn't help but think about how differently this day could have gone if he had just listened to Sarah and ignored that foolish stare. The egg had taken just seconds to throw, but the consequences would last much longer than the 15 minutes it took to get him into handcuffs. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows of the police station, Jake sat in the holding area, watching as officers processed his paperwork. His tourist map of London had fallen from his pocket and lay crumpled on the floor, a bitter reminder of how his vacation had gone terribly wrong. "Henderson," called an officer, "the embassy has been notified of your situation." The news made Jake's stomach sink even further. Not only was he in trouble with British authorities, but now his own country's officials were involved. In another part of the station, Detective Emily Roberts was reviewing the CCTV footage of the incident. The cameras had captured everything in crystal clear detail, from the morning conversation at the cafe to the moment of the egg throwing. She could even see Jake's friends encouraging him and setting up their phones to record. "Look at this," she said to Inspector Wilson, pointing at the screen. "They actually planned it during breakfast. This wasn't a spontaneous act." The footage showed Sarah trying to stop them multiple times, which worked in her favor. She had been released after giving her statement, but Mike and Tom weren't so lucky. They were still being questioned about their role in the incident. Jake's phone, now in police possession, kept buzzing with notifications. News of his arrest had already reached social media, but not in the way he had hoped. People were sharing photos and videos of his arrest, with comments condemning his disrespect for British traditions and military personnel. A knock on the door interrupted Detective Roberts' review. "The guard who was attacked is here to make his statement," announced a junior officer. The Royal Guard, now in his regular military uniform, entered the room. His name was James Mitchell, a decorated sergeant with 10 years of service. Without his ceremonial uniform and bearskin hat, he looked like any other professional soldier. "I want to press charges," Sergeant Mitchell stated firmly. "This behavior has been increasing lately because of social media trends. It needs to stop." Meanwhile, Jake's friends were dealing with their own problems. Mike's parents had called from Chicago, furious about his involvement. Tom sat alone in an interview room, realizing that the $50 he had contributed to the dare might end up costing him thousands in legal fees. Sarah had returned to their hotel, packing Jake's belongings since he wouldn't be allowed back until after his court appearance. She found his travel journal, where he had written his London bucket list. "Make an awesome viral video" was written and underlined twice. She closed the journal, shaking her head at how badly that goal had turned out. Back at the station, Jake was allowed to make his first phone call. His hands trembled as he dialed his parents' number. It was early morning in Ohio, and he hated having to wake them with such bad news. "Mom," his voice cracked. "Something happened. I'm at a police station in London." The silence on the other end was deafening before his mother's worried voice filled his ear. "What did you do, Jake?" As Jake explained the situation, he could hear his father in the background, already contacting their family lawyer. The reality of needing international legal help made everything feel even more serious. Inspector Wilson watched through the window as Jake broke down during the phone call. He had seen many tourists get into trouble, but this case was different. The growing trend of social media challenges targeting the Royal Guards had become a serious concern. "Sir," a junior officer approached with some papers. "The American Embassy has sent over some documents. They're requesting a meeting with the detainee." The inspector nodded, reviewing the papers. The case was growing bigger by the hour. What started as a foolish prank was now involving multiple agencies, embassies, and military personnel. In the holding area, Jake had finished his call and sat with his head in his hands. The events of the day played over and over in his mind. The dare, the egg, the arrest. Every decision that led to this moment seemed incredibly stupid now. Outside the police station, reporters had gathered, hoping to get a statement about the Royal Guard egg incident, as they were calling it. Jake had wanted fame, and now he had it, just not the kind he had hoped for. The clock on the wall showed it was only 2 p.m. Jake still had a long day ahead of him, filled with more questioning, paperwork, and the growing realization that his actions would have consequences far beyond this London police station. The American Embassy representative, Ms. Diana Chen, sat across from Jake in the police station's meeting room. Her expression was serious as she reviewed his case file. The fluorescent lights overhead cast harsh shadows, making Jake look even more exhausted and defeated than he felt. "Mr. Henderson," Miss Chen began, adjusting her glasses, "I need you to understand that what you did today isn't just a simple prank gone wrong. You've created an international incident." Jake shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The word international made everything sound so much worse. His tourist visa lay on the table between them, along with his passport, both currently suspended. "The British authorities are taking this very seriously," Miss Chen continued. "Assaulting a member of the Queen's Guard is considered an attack on military personnel. You could be facing significant fines and even jail time." Outside the meeting room, Inspector Wilson was dealing with another problem. The video of Jake's prank had gone viral, but not in the way Jake had hoped. Major news networks were requesting statements, and social media was flooded with opinions about the incident. "Sir," a young officer interrupted, "the military command wants to know if they should issue a formal statement. This is getting a lot of attention." Meanwhile, Mike and Tom had been released, but were ordered not to leave London. Their parents had arranged for them to move to a different hotel, wanting them as far from the situation as possible. Both had received calls from their university's dean. Their scholarships could be in jeopardy depending on the outcome of this case. Sarah remained the only one still at their original hotel. She sat on her bed, watching the news coverage of her friend's arrest on the small TV. Every channel seemed to be showing the same footage: Jake throwing the egg, the guard standing stoically, and the swift arrest that followed. Back at the station, Jake learned more about what he was facing. Ms. Chen laid out the charges one by one: assault on military personnel, disorderly conduct, vandalism of a military uniform, and public nuisance. "The minimum fine is £5,000, she explained, watching Jake's face pale at the amount. "That's about 6,000, $300 US dollars. And that's just the beginning. Jake's parents had already spoken with their family lawyer back in Ohio, who was now trying to find a British legal representative for their son. The costs were mounting before any formal charges had even been filed. "What about my flight home?" Jake asked weakly. "It's scheduled for next week." Ms. Chen shook her head. "You won't be going anywhere until after your court appearance. That could take weeks to arrange. You'll need to find accommodation and report to the police station daily." In another part of London, Sergeant James Mitchell, the guard who had been hit, was giving interviews to his superiors. His stained uniform had been photographed as evidence, and the military was calculating the cost of replacement, another expense that would be added to Jake's charges. "It's not about the uniform," Sergeant Mitchell explained to his commanding officer. "It's about respect for what we represent. These social media pranks are getting out of hand." Jake's phone, still in police custody, continued to buzz with notifications. His social media accounts were being flooded with messages, some mocking, some angry, and some from news outlets requesting interviews. His dream of going viral had come true in the worst possible way. By evening, Jake was moved to a proper holding cell. He would spend the night in custody until arrangements could be made for his temporary release. The cell was small and cold, with a hard bench and a small window high up on the wall. As he sat there, he could hear other detainees being brought in, drunk tourists, pickpockets, the usual Friday night crowd. But none of them had managed to create an international incident over a rotten egg. Ms. Chen's words echoed in his head. "Actions have consequences, Mr. Henderson. Sometimes they're bigger than we ever imagined." Through his cell window, Jake could see the London sky turning dark. Somewhere out there, Buckingham Palace was preparing for its evening guard change. The ceremony would go on as it had for hundreds of years, unaffected by his foolish attempt at fame. His viral moment had lasted 15 minutes. The consequences, he was beginning to realize, would last much longer. After spending a night in the holding cell, Jake was awakened early by the sound of keys rattling. Inspector Wilson stood at the cell door with Jake's new temporary living arrangements paperwork. "Your parents have arranged for a small flat in East London," the inspector explained, handing Jake a stack of documents. "You'll be required to report to this station every morning at 9 a.m. until your court date. Your passport will remain in our custody." Jake's appearance had changed dramatically in just 24 hours. His tourist clothes were wrinkled from sleeping in the cell, and dark circles had formed under his eyes. His usual confident smile was replaced by a worried frown as he reviewed the strict conditions of his temporary release. "We've also been contacted by your university," Inspector Wilson continued. "They're very interested in the outcome of this case. Apparently, you're on a partial scholarship." Jake's heart sank even lower. He was supposed to start his senior year in a few months, but now everything was uncertain. The dean had emailed him directly, mentioning a possible disciplinary hearing upon his return. Outside the police station, London life continued as usual. The morning newspapers all carried the story of the American student who attacked a royal guard. Some headlines were harsh. "Tourists' social media stunt backfires. Royal Guard assault leads to arrest. American student faces serious charges for palace prank." Jake's parents had hired Mr. Geoffrey Barnes, a local British lawyer specializing in international cases. The lawyer's office was in a fancy building near the Thames, making Jake feel even more intimidated as he walked in for their first meeting. "The situation is quite serious," Mr. Barnes said, reviewing the case files. "The military wants to make an example of this case to discourage similar behavior. They're pushing for the maximum penalties." The lawyer's fees alone were astronomical. Jake's father had to take out a loan to cover the initial retainer. The family's planned vacation to Hawaii for Christmas would have to be cancelled. Meanwhile, Jake's social media nightmare continued to grow. His prank video had indeed gone viral, but the comments were vicious. People from around the world were condemning his actions, calling him names, and demanding harsh punishment. "You'll need to shut down all your social media accounts," Mr. Barnes advised. "Any public statements could hurt your case. We need to show the court that you understand the gravity of your actions." Sarah had returned to America with Mike and Tom, all three giving statements before leaving. Only Jake remained in London, now staying in a tiny studio apartment that cost more per week than his monthly rent back home. The royal guard he had assaulted, Sergeant Mitchell, had submitted his formal statement. It was detailed and professional, describing not just the incident, but also the increasing problem of tourists harassing guards for social media content. Each morning, Jake had to walk 20 minutes to the police station to sign in. The officers there had memorized his face, and some gave him disapproving looks as he walked through the doors. His temporary visa restrictions meant he couldn't work or travel outside London. One afternoon, sitting alone in his rented flat, Jake found his old camera roll. Photos from just days ago showed him smiling with his friends at Tower Bridge, riding the London Eye, and posing at Platform 9 and 3/4 at King's Cross Station. Everything had changed so quickly. His phone rang. It was his mother calling for their daily check-in. "The university wants another meeting with the dean," she said softly. "They're talking about possible suspension." Jake looked out his window at the grey London sky. The city he had been so excited to visit now felt like a prison. His dream vacation had turned into a nightmare, and the worst part was knowing it was entirely his own fault. Mr. Barnes had scheduled another meeting for tomorrow to discuss plea options. The word plea made it all feel so criminal, so serious. Jake had never imagined that a stupid prank for social media could destroy so much: his senior year, his family's savings, his future job prospects. As night fell over London, Jake sat on his small bed, writing in his journal. Something his lawyer suggested to show the court his remorse was genuine. The entry was simple but honest. "I never thought 15 minutes of foolishness could cost me everything." 3 months after the infamous egg-throwing incident, Jake Henderson stood before the British Magistrate Court. The courtroom was smaller than he had imagined, but it felt just as intimidating as any he had seen in movies. "Will the defendant please rise?" the court clerk announced. Jake stood, wearing the new suit his parents had bought for his court appearance. He had lost weight during his forced stay in London, and the suit hung slightly loose on his frame. His father sat in the gallery behind him, having flown in for the hearing. The family couldn't afford for both parents to come. Mr. Barnes, his lawyer, had prepared him well for this moment. The strategy was to show complete remorse and accept full responsibility. No excuses, no attempts to minimize what he had done. "Your Honor," Mr. Barnes addressed the court, "my client wishes to make a statement before sentencing." Jake's hands trembled as he read from his prepared statement. "I stand here today deeply ashamed of my actions. What I did was not just disrespectful to Sergeant Mitchell and the Royal Guards, but to the entire British military and your country's traditions. I let a foolish desire for social media fame cloud my judgment." The prosecutor then presented Sergeant Mitchell's impact statement. The guard himself was present, sitting straight-backed in his military uniform. His presence made Jake's shame even more acute. After what felt like hours, the magistrate delivered her verdict. The fine was set at £8,000, approximately $10,000, plus court costs. Jake would have a criminal record, and his actions would be reported to U.S. authorities. He would be banned from entering the United Kingdom for 5 years. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited with cameras and microphones. Jake's story had become a cautionary tale about social media pranks and disrespecting cultural institutions. His lawyer guided him through the crowd, avoiding questions. Back in his small rented flat, Jake packed his belongings. His father helped in silence, both men exhausted from the stress of the past months. The total costs had been staggering: legal fees, accommodation, fines, cancelled flights, and his father's lost wages from taking time off work. Jake's university had placed him on academic probation. He would have to write a lengthy paper about cultural sensitivity and complete community service hours before being allowed to return to classes. His graduation would be delayed by at least a semester. His former friends had moved on with their lives. Mike and Tom had blocked him on social media after being criticized for their role in the incident. Only Sarah still sent occasional supportive messages, though their friendship would never be the same. The next morning, Jake and his father headed to Heathrow Airport. Before leaving, Jake had one final stop to make: Buckingham Palace. Not to see the guards this time, but to deliver a handwritten letter of apology to the Royal Guard unit through official channels. As they drove past the palace gates, Jake caught a glimpse of a Royal Guard at his post. The sight made his stomach twist with regret. A small crowd of tourists was taking photos, all maintaining a respectful distance. "Look, son," his father said, pointing to a new sign near the guard post. It read, "Respect our guards. harassment will result in arrest and prosecution. Jake's case had led to stricter enforcement and clearer warnings for tourists. At the airport, Jake went through additional security screening due to his new criminal record. His father squeezed his shoulder supportively. "You made a mistake, son, a big one. But it's how you learn from it that matters." On the flight home, Jake wrote in his journal one last time. His London entry would end very differently from how he had imagined when he first arrived. Instead of social media fame and fun memories, he had gained hard lessons about respect, consequences, and the true cost of thoughtless actions. As the plane took off, Jake looked down at London becoming smaller below. The city would remember him as the tourist who threw an egg at a royal guard, but he would remember it as the place where he learned that 15 minutes of foolishness could change your life forever. Back home in Ohio, a new sign would hang on Jake's wall, right above his desk. It would show a quote he had written himself. "Think twice, act once. Some mistakes cost more than money." Below it would be his court documents, framed not as a badge of shame, but as a permanent reminder that every action has consequences, and some lessons must be learned the hard way.